What was anticipated to be a fun and exciting adventure for a group of Girl Scouts turns into a brutal nightmare for 3 young girls. On June 13, 1977, a shocking discovery is made at Camp Scott near Locust Grove, Oklahoma, northeast of Tulsa.
Locust Grove is a very small town in Mays County, very rural area.
100 Girl Scouts arrived at Camp Scott by bus on Sunday, June 12th for their annual week-long getaway.
There was a thunderstorm that night, and as you can imagine, the girls, they were all kind of wound up, and it was lights out at around 8 or 8:30.
At around 1:30 a.m., June 13th, Carla Wilhite was awakened by a noise she heard coming from the woods. She described the sound as a low, moaning, guttural sound. Carla started down the path in the direction of the sound. As she got closer, she shined her flashlight in the direction of the sound. The sound stopped. Carla concluded that it was probably an animal and decided to go back to her tent to get out of the storm. At 6 a.m., Carla Wilhite was on her way to take a shower when she saw 10-year-old Denise Milner lying on top of her sleeping bag near the base of a tree, about 100 yards from her tent. As Carla got closer, she also found Michelle Gousset, age 9, and Lori Farmer, age 8, inside their sleeping bags. All 3 girls were dead. Confused and horrified by what she had discovered, she turned and ran for help and returned to the scene with the camp director and nurse.
The other counselors immediately started to do a head count of the girls in Kiowa camp. The counselor that went to tent number 8 realized that there were no girls in the tent. She also recognized that there were no sleeping bags on the beds. So she went running back and told the other counselors that tent number 8 was empty. All the other tents in the camp had 4 girls in them. Tent number 8 only had 3 girls.
The 4th girl that was supposed to be in tent 8 happened to be Kristen Chenoweth. She missed camp due to an illness. Only one night into the trip, and tragedy had struck the Girl Scout camp.
3 young girls, ages 8, 9, and 10, were brutally beaten, attacked, and killed by an unknown assailant. The evidence strongly indicates that the girls were attacked while sleeping in their tent, were sexually assaulted, and were taken from the tent and left some distance away.
I lived probably 7 or 8 miles from the scene. I can remember we couldn't go out and play as freely. You know, it was on every news channel. It was everywhere. Everybody was talking about it everywhere you went.
Officials quickly evacuated the rest of the camp. The Mays County Sheriff's Office and Oklahoma State Troopers set up a perimeter around the 400-acre camp. Hundreds of other law enforcement officials soon descended on the camp in search of clues and hopefully a suspect.
When we arrive at a scene like that, or any scene, the first thing we want to do is get an overall view and kind of get an idea of what we're looking at. And I don't think any of them were prepared for, seeing a 8, 9, and 10-year-old girl in that condition.
Searchers were overwhelmed by the size of the camp and the dense brush and trees.
We believe Lori and Michelle were probably most likely killed in the tent, and that Denise was either carried or made to walk to the location where the bodies were found. It sort of is broken up into several different scenes. There were some items that were collected at the tent. There were some blood stains inside the tent, at the bodies. Of course, the bodies were there, their clothing items, their sleeping bag. There was a flashlight that had been modified.
A mobile command post was set up at the camp to coordinate law enforcement officials as they began interviews.
In reading the reports from OSBI and other reports, I counted one time 139 people that was actually interviewed and potential suspects in this case.
A local resident was squirrel hunting near the camp when he came across a cave entrance and informed authorities of his discovery. Inside the cave, investigators discovered a newspaper and a roll of masking tape. A forensic specialist was able to match the torn end of the roll of the masking tape to a torn end on the flashlight.
Among other items that were found were broken sunglasses in a beige vinyl case. When the camp counselors were interviewed, one of the counselors reported that she had some sunglasses missing from her tent. The sunglasses that were found in the cave belonged to her, and 2 photographs.
Officials learned that Jean Leroy Hart might have developed the pictures while serving time at Granite Reformatory.
Jean Leroy Hart was a native of Locust Grove, Oklahoma. He had kind of violent sexual history. 4 years earlier, Jean Leroy Hart, who was very well known to Sheriff Weaver, escaped from the Mays County Jail and had been on the loose ever since.
In 1966, Jean Leroy Hart abducted 2 women from the parking lot of a nightclub in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He was released on parole, but ended up back in prison for theft.
You got his own admittance of kidnapping, raping, leaving for dead women. Jean Hart fit the characteristics of a serial rapist.
In 1973, Jean Leroy Hart was transferred from the state prison back to Mays County Jail. Shortly after his arrival, he escaped, but authorities were able to quickly apprehend him. He was returned to the Mays County Jail, then escaped again.
When Jean Leroy Hart escaped from the Mays County Jail the second time, another inmate escaped with him, whose name was Larry Dry. Larry Dry was apprehended a short time later.
Dry states that he and Hart would use plastic or paper with a pinhole poked in it to cover the flashlight and reduce the chance of being detected. A massive manhunt ensued in pursuit of Jean Leroy Hart. Some members of law enforcement believed that he was still in the vicinity of Locust Grove and that friends and family members were helping him avoid capture. On April 6, 1978, the OSBI was finally able to track him down.
At 4:15 p.m. this afternoon, agents of the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation arrested Jean Leroy Hart at a rural residence in the Cookson Hills in southern Adair County.
Hart was brought in, escorted by 2 agents from the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation. He will be kept here at the prison until preliminary hearings in Mays County, where the murder of the 3 Girl Scouts took place.
Jean Leroy Hart's preliminary hearing began this morning amidst tight security as a packed courtroom looked on and an overflow audience watched the proceedings on closed-circuit television in a nearby auditorium.
What's it for?
The most interesting development of the day was the revelation from OSBI agent Arthur Linville that Hart's name first came up as a suspect on the day of the murders because the use of black tape and cord to bind the victims was similar to Hart's alleged attacks on 2 women in 1966.
It's such an emotional thing being over here because for 2 days we've gone over what happened to our child. And it's hard to sit in the courtroom with someone who might have done it.
The drama intensified somewhat today as Hart returned for the 4th day of the hearing. But even with the testimony of Larry Dry, the prosecution has yet to place Hart in the campground or firmly link him to the murders.
It was beginning to seem that Jean Leroy Hart's preliminary hearing might become a permanent fixture here at the Mays County Courthouse. But Special Judge Jess Clanton this morning took the unusual step of announcing that the hearing will come to an end, one way or another, by 1 week from today.
Two months after his acquittal, Jean Leroy Hart died from a heart attack in the workout yard of the state prison.
I mean, it's obvious that he was acquitted of the charges. I really don't think I can go into that because that thing just, yeah. All I can tell you is what the outcome was.
In the late 80s, the FBI was in the early stages of developing DNA analysis. The OSBI sent several items to them for testing. Though none of the evidence pinpointed Gene Leroy Hart, none of it excluded him as well.
DNA just added more validity to the pile of what was already quite obvious. We have been able to exclude every suspect other than Gene Hart. And they did not have the information that I have and have shared with you just to this point. I believe it would have been a completely different outcome. But
it's a case that has haunted Oklahoma for nearly 5 decades. Lori Farmer, Michelle Gousset, and Denise Milner were raped and murdered in Mays County in 1977.
As News 9's Reagan Ledbetter reports, DNA evidence in the Girl Scout murders is finally giving the victims' families answers.
9 years ago, Lori Farmer's parents sat down with Mays County Sheriff Mike Reed and asked him to take a new look at the case. They had no idea what he and OSBI agents would uncover. A request turned into a 9-year mission to find out the truth about what happened to the Girl Scouts who were raped and murdered at Camp Scott, and put an end to the hundreds of conspiracy theories. On June 12, 1977, 8-year-old Lori Farmer, 9-year-old Michelle Gousset, and 10-year-old Denise Milner set off for camp, but never came home. There was an arrest, a trial, and an acquittal. Sheriff Mike Reed grew up here in Mays County and was just a boy when the murders shocked the conscience of this small community. He never imagined years later he'd be the one asked to find answers.
And I give him my word that I didn't know what I could do, but I would look at it.
A year after Reed started looking at the case, he went to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in Virginia, where 23 of the best homicide investigators, FBI behavioral analysts, and profilers in the world make up a cold case board. And they all spent a month independently combing through every document and every piece of evidence. Each and every one of them had come to the same conclusion. The only person to commit these murders was Gene Leroy Hart.
Those people who don't live in Oklahoma, don't have any thought about who it should be, arrived at the same conclusion that Mike already had.
There is absolutely no doubt whatsoever that Gene Hart is the person who committed these crimes.
The jury never heard that in 1966, Hart kidnapped 2 pregnant women at gunpoint, drove them to the middle of nowhere in Mays County, tied them up, raped them repeatedly, covered them in brush, and left them for dead.
Textbook serial rapist. You're convicted of that, and you're paroled in 2.5 years and back out on the road.
After all his research and going through the evidence over and over, he says he can disprove every wild theory out there with actual facts.
The camp is quieter now. The weeds have grown a little higher, and all the Girl Scouts are gone. The memories remain.